The year was 1974. One man was still fighting World War II, not in his memory, not as a figure of speech, in a real jungle on a real island, with a real rifle, hunting real enemies. Japan had been at peace for 29 years. Hiroo Onoda did not know. He was born in 1922 in Kamikawa, a small mountain village in Wakayama Prefecture. His mother was strict and deliberate. She believed that a man without discipline was not a man at all. His father ran the local school. They had 7 children. Hiroo was the 4th. As a boy, he was quiet and observant. He noticed things others missed. He did not speak unless he meant it. Teachers remembered him as serious. Classmates remembered him as someone you did not argue with. At 16, he went to work at a trading company in China. He spent 3 years in Hankow, learning Mandarin, watching how foreign countries operated. He saw the chaos of occupied China up close. He saw Japanese soldiers running checkpoints in someone else's streets. He filed everything away. He was 19 years old. Already he was building a picture of the world that would shape everything after. In 1942, he was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He excelled immediately. His superiors noticed his composure. They noticed his precision. They noticed that he did not panic when others panicked. He was eventually selected for something extraordinary. In 1944, Onoda was sent to the Futamata Army Intelligence School. This was not an ordinary military installation. It did not train soldiers in the conventional sense. It trained men to disappear, men who could live behind enemy lines for months or years, men who operated in total isolation with no support, no radio, no reinforcements. The school was located in Futamata, a small town in Shizuoka Prefecture. Its existence was classified. The students were not told who else had been recruited. They were not told where they were going after graduation. They were trained in field medicine, in code writing, in the psychology of interrogation, in how to endure captivity, in how to read a landscape for hiding places, water sources, escape routes. They were taught how to identify plants that were edible, and plants that were not, how to move through jungle without leaving a trail, how to sleep light and wake fast. The curriculum assumed that every man who graduated would be alone, completely alone, for an unknown period. That was not presented as a worst-case scenario. That was presented as the expected outcome. The school produced men built for conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. Inside a week, most men would break. These men would not. Onoda was not afraid of what he heard. He was energized by it. This was what he had been built for. The training was simply the language for something he already knew. The school's philosophy was absolute. A soldier's duty came before everything, before family, before comfort, before survival itself. The instructors were clear. You may die hungry, you may die sick, but you will never die a coward. You will never surrender. That lesson would not become clear for another 30 years. One phrase from graduation echoed through everything that followed. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, addressed the graduates in the autumn of 1944. He said, "You are soldiers of Japan. You will never give up. You will never lay down your weapons without orders from a superior officer. That is the only law you obey." Onoda repeated those words to himself every day for 30 years. In December 1944, he was deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines. He was 22 years old. He carried an Arisaka rifle, a military sword, and written orders. The mission was simple: disrupt Allied operations and hold the island. Japanese forces would return. Lubang Island is not a small place. It is roughly 75 square kilometers, a narrow island between Mindoro and the Batangas coast. Its interior is dense jungle, cut through with river valleys and ridgelines. The population in 1944 was several thousand farmers and fishermen. The island had been a Japanese military staging area. It had an airstrip. It had a small garrison. It had supply lines that connected to the larger Philippine campaign. When Allied forces swept through, all of that infrastructure was abandoned or destroyed. What remained was the jungle, and 4 men who had decided it was not yet time to leave. Onoda knew the island's terrain better than most people know their own neighborhood. He had mapped its river systems by walking them. He had catalogued its fruit trees by season. He had identified 17 separate hiding positions in the interior. Each one could shelter 2 men from a search party for at least a week. He had built that knowledge the same way he built everything, deliberately, patiently, without waste. He was told reinforcements were coming. He believed them. But that never happened. Within months, American forces swept through the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur made good on his promise to return. Japanese resistance crumbled island by island. Lubang fell to Allied forces in February 1945. Most Japanese soldiers on the island surrendered or were killed. Onoda and 3 companions retreated into the jungle. Their names were Yuichi Akatsu, Shoichi Shimada, and Kinshichi Kazuka. They watched American flags rise over the villages. They watched jeeps roll down roads that had once been Japanese territory. Onoda said the same thing each time. This is not real. Japan does not fall. This is a trap designed to break our resolve. His companions believed him. He was their superior officer. His certainty was armor. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke to Japan by radio for the first time. He announced Japan's unconditional surrender. He used formal court language that many barely understood, but the meaning was clear. The war was over. That broadcast reached every corner of Japan. It reached prisoners in camps across Asia. It reached sailors at sea and soldiers in caves across the Pacific. But it did not reach 4 men in the jungle on Lubang Island. Onoda's radio was broken. His orders were to trust no information that had not come through official military channels. When leaflets began falling from Allied planes, "The war is over. Return home." Onoda picked one up, read it carefully, and handed it to the others. "Enemy propaganda," he said. "Well produced," he admitted. "But propaganda. No one expected what came next." In September 1945, Japanese officers came to the island by boat with a loudspeaker. They called out that the war had ended. They urged any soldiers in the jungle to come forward. Onoda watched from the tree line. He saw men who looked Japanese in Allied company. He concluded they were collaborators, or actors, or prisoners being coerced. He moved deeper into the jungle. In 1946, letters written by Onoda's family were dropped from a plane. His brother's handwriting, his mother's signature. The letters described their childhood home, their street, the names of neighbors. Onoda read them in the jungle. Something moved in his chest. Then he put the feeling aside. The enemy could have forced this information out of a prisoner. The letters were fake. That certainty held. It always held. Life in the jungle found its shape. The 4 men built shelters from bamboo and palm fronds. They collected rainwater in woven baskets. They stalked wild pigs through the underbrush. They raided farms at the island's edge before dawn. They took rice, sweet potatoes, bananas. They were careful. They were disciplined. They never stayed in one place long. They also fought. Local villagers reported attacks. Filipino police launched search operations. Shots were exchanged in the dark. The 4 men vanished into the jungle each time. They left nothing but boot prints in the mud. The years began to move. In 1949, Yuichi Akatsu slipped away from the group one night without a word. He had been growing quieter for months. He spent 6 months alone before walking out of the trees with his hands up. He surrendered to Filipino forces. He went home to Japan. He told authorities that Onoda was still alive and still fighting. That detail would matter later. The Japanese government was shocked. They launched a search operation. Aircraft circled the island and dropped leaflets. They bore the official surrender order, signed by General Yamashita. Onoda found one. He studied the signature. He concluded it was forged. Yamashita had been executed in 1946. Why would a dead general sign a surrender order in 1949? He filed it away as further evidence of Allied deception. In 1952, the Philippine government printed the surrender order in the Manila Times. They dropped copies over the island from planes. Onoda read one on the ground at his feet. He noted the newspaper's date. Then he pointed out that the enemy could print anything in a newspaper. That meant nothing. In 1953, Shoichi Shimada was shot in the leg during a skirmish with Filipino forces. Onoda spent weeks nursing him back. But in May 1954, Shimada was shot and killed near the beach. A search party had found their trail. He was 37 years old. Onoda buried him in the jungle with full military honours. He stood over the grave and saluted. Then he walked back into the trees with Kozuka. They did not speak of it again. He was 32 years old. He had been in the jungle for almost a decade. He had not spoken to a friendly face since 1944. But that was not the hardest part. The hardest part was the noise, not the jungle noise. He had made peace with that. The hardest part was the silence where the future was supposed to be. Onoda had a mission. he executed it. But there was nothing to look forward to. No reinforcements coming, no end date. Just the jungle, and the orders, and the man next to him. By the late 1950s, Onoda and Kozuka had settled into a fixed routine. It felt almost ordinary. They split their time between 3 base camps. They tracked the movements of local fishing boats for intelligence. They maintained their weapons with obsessive care. They kept a log of every operation, every patrol, every sighting. Onoda shaved using rainwater and a blade he sharpened on river stone. He washed his uniform when it rained and hung it to dry in the canopy. He read the same pages of a military manual he had carried since 1944. The paper came apart at the folds. He did these things not because they mattered to the war. He did them because they were his. They were the shape of a life. In 1959, Onoda's family came to the island for the second time. His older brother stood on a hilltop overlooking the jungle and called through a megaphone. He used Hiroo's childhood nickname. He described their mother's kitchen. He said their father had died. He said the country was different now. He said everyone was waiting. Onoda was in the trees 30 meters away. He heard every word. He felt something cold move through him. Then he turned and walked back to camp. To his diary, he wrote one line. The enemy has studied our family well. No one expected what came next. In 1972, Kinshichi Kozuka was shot and killed by Filipino police. 27 years had passed since the war ended. He died during a raid on a rice depot near the island's south shore. He was 51 years old. Onoda was alone. For the first time since 1944, he had no one to talk to. He moved camp every 3 days. He kept his rifle cleaned and his log up to date. Solitude had a different weight than he expected. In the early years, silence between him and his companions had felt like shared resolve. Now it was just silence. He filled it the only way he knew. He kept moving. He kept the mission. He was 50 years old. His uniform had been repaired so many times, the original fabric was gone in sections. He had made new bootlaces from braided vine fibre. His boots had been rebuilt twice. His rifle he maintained like a surgeon maintains a blade. It was the one thing that had never let him down. He slept in 3-hour intervals. He did calisthenics every morning at first light. He was, by any objective measure, one of the most capable soldiers alive, and he had nowhere to aim it. News of Kozuka's death reached Tokyo and caused a sensation. A Japanese soldier, still fighting, killed in action in the Philippines in 1972. The story ran on every front page. The government launched another search operation. Soldiers and diplomats combed the island's trails. They found nothing. The jungle had given Onoda back its silence. The Japanese public reacted to the news with something complicated. Part horror, part pride, part grief. He was a man who had refused to quit. For some people, that was inspiring. For others, it was a reminder of something they would rather not look at directly. The war had been over for 27 years. Japan had rebuilt itself into one of the world's largest economies. The country that had fought that war was, in some real sense, gone, replaced by a democratic state with a pacifist constitution. A country that, officially, no longer had a military. Somewhere in the Pacific, a man was still fighting, still shooting, in the name of an empire that had dissolved before most young Japanese adults were born. There was no clean response to that. The government's search party included men who had known Onoda, former comrades, old unit officers. They walked the trails calling his name. No answer. He had been living in those trees for 27 years. He was not going to walk out because someone called. Then something unexpected happened. In February 1974, a 23-year-old Japanese student named Norio Suzuki bought a ticket to Manila. He carried a camera and a small pack. He told people he wanted to find the 3 rarest things in the world: Onoda, a panda, and a yeti. His friends thought he was crazy. He walked into the jungle on Lubang Island alone. No military escort, no search party, just a young man with a backpack. His theory: everyone else had failed because they were looking for a ghost. He was looking for a person. 3 days later, he found a campfire, and next to it, an old man in a tattered uniform. Onoda had his rifle raised before Suzuki could speak. But Suzuki did not run. He sat down cross-legged in the dirt. He said calmly, "Onoda-san, my name is Suzuki. Your family misses you." Onoda stared at him for a long time. Then slowly, he lowered the rifle. They talked through the night and into the next day. Suzuki told him everything: the surrender, the post-war miracle, the bullet train, television. Onoda listened carefully. He was not agitated. He was precise. He asked clarifying questions. He did not argue with the facts, but he said one thing clearly at the end. He would not lay down his arms, not without a direct order from his commanding officer. That had always been the rule. He could not change it now. What happened next? No one had planned for. Suzuki flew back to Japan. He contacted the government. He found Major Taniguchi in Tokyo, running a small bookshop. Taniguchi was 58. Suzuki explained what he had seen. Taniguchi closed the shop and bought a plane ticket. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi walked into the jungle wearing his old uniform. Onoda was waiting. He was in full uniform. His weapon was clean. His logbook was tucked under his arm. He came to attention and saluted. Taniguchi stood before him and read the official order aloud. Private Onoda Hiroo, I hereby order you to cease all military activities immediately. As of this day, all military activity is concluded. You are hereby relieved of your duties. Onoda did not move for a long time. Then he reached down and placed his rifle on the ground. He removed the ammunition pouch. He set it beside the rifle. He removed his bayonet, his grenades. He set each item on the ground in order, carefully, precisely. His hands moved slowly, the way a man moves when he cannot afford to think. He had spent 30 years in that jungle. He had killed 30 people. He had wounded over 100 more. He had eaten wild pig and rainwater. He had outlasted 3 companions, 2 Philippine presidents, and the entire post-war world. He had fought a war for longer than most wars last. He was 52 years old. The war was over. But that was not the end of the story. The Philippine government called for his prosecution on murder charges. Families of those killed in raids filed formal complaints. But President Ferdinand Marcos made a different decision. He granted Onoda a full pardon. He said Onoda had acted in good faith. He had believed he was fulfilling his duty. That was enough. Onoda flew back to Japan. He had not been home since 1944. He landed at Haneda Airport in a country he did not recognize. The airport was beyond anything he had imagined. The size, the glass, the moving walkways. 30,000 people lined the road from the airport into the city. He smiled for the cameras. But in interviews, he said the same thing over and over. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had arrived 30 years too late. He felt like a ghost in someone else's country. He met with Emperor Hirohito at the Imperial Palace. He accepted a commendation. He stood in the reception hall in a new suit and looked at the chandeliers. He said afterward that all he could think about was how much electricity they used. The idea of abundance still did not feel real. Modern Japan overwhelmed him. The speed, the noise, the vending machines on every corner, pachinko parlors, high-rise buildings, women in Western clothing. His mother was dead. His father was dead. Several siblings had died while he was in the jungle. The Japan he had gone to war for no longer existed. Within a year, he emigrated to Brazil. He bought land in Mato Grosso and became a cattle rancher. He built a farm from nothing. He grew his own food. He fell into a rhythm that resembled, at a comfortable distance, the rhythm of the jungle. He married there. He taught young Japanese immigrants how to track, how to endure. He taught them discipline. He taught them how to hold together when everything was falling apart. He was a good teacher. He had no patience for pretending things were easy. But there was something he could not leave behind. He returned to Japan in the 1980s. He founded a nature school in the mountains of Fukushima. He took teenagers into the wilderness for weeks at a time. He taught them to light fires and find water and walk in silence. He said modern Japanese children had lost something vital, the knowledge that they could survive alone. He never apologized for the killings. He said the dead were casualties of war. As far as he knew, it had never ended. He acknowledged the tragedy. He did not accept guilt. But he spent 4 decades trying to give something back, not to the people he had hurt, to the idea that discipline and endurance were not just military values. They were human ones. Hiroo Onoda died in Tokyo in January 2014 at 91 years old. He was 91. He had spent 30 years in a jungle, then 40 years building a life in a world he had never planned for. He crossed 3 continents. He learned 3 ways to survive. He never stopped being a soldier in some essential sense. Not because he wanted to fight, because discipline and structure were the only language he had ever been taught. The jungle had not broken that. The homecoming had not broken that. Nothing broke it. He organized it into something that, in the last decades of his life, looked like peace. His nature school in Fukushima ran for over 2 decades. Thousands of young Japanese people went through its programs. They learned to read weather, to find direction without instruments, to move quietly, to sleep on ground, to be still when still was what the situation required. None of them were training for war. They were training for something harder to define. Onoda said it was about being able to face yourself in silence, about knowing what you are capable of when no one is watching. He said something else in his later years that stayed with people. He said he did not regret the 30 years. Not the hunger, not the loneliness, not the deaths of his companions, not the men he had killed. He said regret was not the right frame. It had been his life, the only life he had lived. You do not regret a life, you account for it. That is a hard position to argue with, and it is a hard position to accept. He had spent 30 years protecting a version of Japan, a version that had never asked him to stop. The Japan he fought for had made peace in 1945. It had rebuilt itself on commerce, education, and constitutional law. It had become something entirely different from what he had been sent to defend. And then, in 1974, it sent a 60-year-old man in an old uniform into a jungle to deliver the news, and Onoda laid down his rifle and stood at attention and waited for orders about what came next. Nobody ever told him what came next. He had to figure that out himself, the same way he had figured out everything else, alone in the jungle, without a manual, without reinforcements, without a plan. After his death, the arguments started again. The ones that had never really stopped. Was he a hero? Was he a monster? Was he a victim? People argued from all of those positions, and none of them felt complete. What the answer tells us about ourselves is the part that stays. The truth is harder to hold. Hiroo Onoda was not insane. He was not stupid. He was a man built by his training to trust his orders over everything, over leaflets, over family voices, over newspapers, over evidence, over time itself. And that training worked exactly as intended. It just kept working long after anyone needed it to. We tell ourselves that reality breaks through eventually, that the truth is always stronger than belief. Hiroo Onoda spent 30 years proving that is not always true. A man with enough discipline can choose a world and live inside it. He can fight a war that has already ended. He can keep a flame burning for a country that no longer exists. That is not a story about madness. That is a story about how we are made, about how loyalty can outlast reason, about how the most powerful force in a human being is commitment to an idea, even when the idea is wrong. Hiroo Onoda walked out of the jungle in 1974. He carried 30 years of war in his hands. He set down his rifle. He stood at attention. He waited for what came next. Nobody had ever taught him what came after the mission ended, and maybe that was the saddest thing of all. He is one of the last people of the 20th century to do this, to live entirely inside a single idea, not a metaphor, an actual idea, an order, a commitment. He organized every day around it for 30 years, his diet, his shelter, his sleep patterns, his relationships, his understanding of what the world was and what it wanted from him. All of it built on a foundation that had dissolved. Before most people reading this story were born, most of us are protected from this by the noise of the world. The noise tells us when things have changed. It tells us through newspapers, through conversations, through visible evidence of a world that is not what we expected. Onoda had none of that. He had the trees and his orders and 3 companions, then 2 companions, then 1, then none, and still the orders, and still the jungle, and still the idea that the mission was not yet finished. What does it take to walk out of something like that? It takes exactly what finally brought him out, not reality, not evidence, not time. It took another human being, someone willing to sit down in the dirt, not to argue, not to produce documents, just to say, "Your family misses you." That was the only sentence that worked.